What happens when one congresswoman decides to ask the question nobody else in Washington dares to? The answer could rewrite what we think we know about power, secrecy, and the Epstein files. And it all started with a single missing signature. Watch how it actually went. The question hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Wolf Blitzer leaned forward across his desk at CNN's Situation Room, the studio lights catching the edge of concern in his expression, and he asked what half of America was thinking. But most of Washington was too afraid to say out loud. Congresswoman Crockett, do you believe the White House is actively hiding information about Jeffrey Epstein's connections to powerful people? The camera cut tight on Jasmine Crockett's face. She didn't blink. She didn't hesitate. And what she said next would set off a political firestorm that would burn for weeks. But before we get to that moment, you need to understand how we got here. Because this story starts not with answers, but with a single missing signature and a stack of files that someone somewhere desperately wants to stay buried. Make sure you hit that subscribe button right now because this story has more twists than a political thriller. And you're going to want to see how one congresswoman decided to ask the questions that everyone else in Washington was too scared to touch. It started 3 weeks earlier, buried on page 17 of a Washington Post article that most people scrolled past without reading. Just a single paragraph, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. Sources familiar with the matter indicate that additional files related to the Jeffrey Epstein investigation remain sealed by court order, with some congressional representatives pushing for their release. One signature is reportedly still required to force a floor vote on disclosure. Most readers skipped right over it. Jasmine Crockett read it 3 times, and each time she read it, the same question got louder in her mind. What could possibly be in those files that's worth this much effort to keep hidden? See, by this point, the world already knew the broad strokes of the Epstein scandal. The private island, the powerful connections, the trafficking operation disguised as luxury jets. Names had been named. Some people had faced consequences. Others had lawyered up and disappeared from public life. But there were still sealed documents, still redacted emails, and still testimony locked behind classified designations and privacy claims. And for most politicians, that was enough. They'd addressed it, made their statements, and moved on to the next news cycle. But Crockett had spent 15 years as a civil rights attorney before coming to Congress. And she'd learned something fundamental during those years. When powerful people fight this hard to keep information secret, it's never because releasing it would hurt nobody. The emails were the key. That's what her sources in the Justice Department were quietly whispering about in encrypted messages and carefully worded phone calls that never quite said anything actionable. There were emails and communications between Epstein and various political figures, business associates, and foreign contacts that painted a much more complete picture than what the public had seen. And somewhere in those emails, Trump's name kept appearing. Not in the explicit smoking gun way that would make headlines simple, but in something potentially more damaging. In references, in implications, in phrasing that suggested a relationship more complex than two knew each other socially decades ago. Explanation that had become the official line. One email in particular had become something of an obsession for investigators who'd seen it. Epstein, writing to a foreign associate, had apparently referred to Trump as the dog that hasn't barked, a phrase that meant nothing to most people but everything to those who understood the reference. In the Sherlock Holmes story, the dog that didn't bark was the crucial clue, the absence that revealed the truth. What Epstein seemed to be saying, according to analysts who'd reviewed the communication, was that Trump knew things but wasn't saying them. The question that followed was obvious. What did he know, and why wasn't he saying it? There were other details carefully kept out of official reports but whispered about in the kind of conversations that happen in secure facilities and never get written down. A victim who'd placed herself at Epstein's residence during specific dates when Trump had also been documented as present. No direct allegations, nothing prosecutable, but the kind of proximity that raised questions about what he'd seen, what he'd known, and what he'd chosen to ignore. And all of it was sitting in files that, for reasons nobody would quite explain, couldn't be released to the public. Crockett started making calls. She reached out to the House Oversight Committee, to the Judiciary Committee, and to colleagues who'd been pushing for transparency on the Epstein investigation since the beginning. What she discovered was a pattern that would have been almost comical if it weren't so disturbing. Everyone agreed the files should be released. Everyone supported transparency. Everyone believed the American people had a right to know. And yet somehow nothing was happening. There were procedural obstacles, they said. Privacy concerns for innocent parties whose names might appear in communications. National security implications that couldn't be discussed. And always just one more signature needed, one more committee review required, and one more reason why now wasn't quite the right time. But then Crockett found something interesting. Technically, under congressional rules, if she could get one more member to sign on to her resolution demanding the file's release, she could force a floor vote. The measure would go directly to the House, bypass all the committee delays and procedural roadblocks, and make every single representative go on record about whether they supported transparency or a cover-up. It was a procedural power move, the kind of parliamentary maneuver that most freshman representatives wouldn't even know existed. Crockett knew it existed, and she knew exactly who she needed to convince to make it happen. Lauren Boebert wasn't the obvious choice. The Colorado Republican had built her brand on performative conservatism and unwavering loyalty to Trump. But she'd also much more quietly been one of the few Republicans who'd consistently voted for measures increasing government transparency and releasing classified documents to Congress. It was the kind of ideological consistency that didn't make headlines, but that Crockett respected. If she could convince Boebert that this was about institutional accountability rather than partisan politics, there was a chance. The meeting happened in one of those anonymous conference rooms that fill the Capitol complex. Bland furniture, bad lighting, the kind of space where nothing interesting is supposed to happen. Crockett made her pitch direct and clean. This isn't about Trump specifically. This is about whether Congress gets to see evidence of potential crimes by any powerful person, or whether the executive branch gets to decide what we're allowed to know. You've voted for transparency before. I'm asking you to do it again. Boebert listened. Her expression was unreadable behind the kind of political poker face that comes from years of knowing that everything you say can and will be used against you. You're asking me to sign something that could damage Trump, she finally said. It wasn't a question. I'm asking you to sign something that demands truth. Crockett corrected. If there's nothing damaging in those files, then releasing them helps Trump by ending the speculation. If there is something damaging, then don't we have an obligation to know about it? Since when did transparency become partisan? What Crockett didn't know, what she wouldn't learn until later, was that Boebert had already been having her own conversations. Conversations with Justice Department officials who'd suggested in the careful language of people who understand how implications work that signing on to Crockett's resolution might not be in her political interest. Conversations with White House staffers who'd made it clear that forcing this vote would be noticed, and not in a good way. Conversations with party leadership who'd explained that loyalty sometimes meant knowing when not to ask questions. The fictional scene that follows is based on accounts pieced together from multiple sources. Some speaking on background, others refusing to speak at all late on a Thursday evening. Boebert was called to a meeting in the Situation Room. Not the famous White House Situation Room, but one of the Capitol's secure facilities that shares the name. When she arrived, she found 2 FBI officials, a DOJ attorney, and a deputy White House counsel she'd never met before. The folders on the table were marked with classification stamps. The conversation was brief and to the point. There were national security equities at stake. Foreign intelligence sources whose identities could be compromised, ongoing investigations that could be jeopardized, and a strong suggestion that perhaps Congresswoman Crockett's resolution, while well-intentioned, was not something that needed additional support right now. Boebert, to her credit, asked the obvious question. If there's nothing to hide, why are you here? The answer she got was a masterclass in bureaucratic non-response. We're not suggesting there's anything to hide. We're suggesting that there are proper channels for review and that forcing a public vote on classified material before that review is complete would be premature and potentially harmful to national interests. She left the meeting without committing either way. But when Crockett reached out the next morning to see if she'd made a decision, Boubert's response was telling, "I need more time." That's when Crockett decided to take the fight public. If they were going to play procedural games and hide behind classification rules, she was going to make them do it in front of cameras. She called Wolf Blitzer's producers and offered an exclusive. She'd go to the Situation Room and lay out exactly what was in the Epstein files that the White House didn't want released, using only information that was already part of the public record, but that nobody had quite connected yet. The segment started normally enough. Blitzer introduced the topic, mentioning the sealed files and the push for transparency. Crockett came out looking calm and prepared, the way she always did when she knew she had the better argument. They talked through the basics, the procedural requirements, the one missing signature, and the general principle of congressional oversight. Then Blitzer asked the question, "Congresswoman, do you believe the White House is actively hiding information about Jeffrey Epstein's connections to powerful people?" Crockett's response was measured, but every word had weight behind it. "Wolf, let me tell you what we know for certain, using only information that's already been reported but that people haven't quite put together. We know that Jeffrey Epstein sent emails referring to a major political figure as the dog that hasn't barked, which in investigative terms suggests someone who has knowledge but isn't sharing it. We know that multiple victims have placed this political figure at Epstein properties during relevant time periods. We know that when Congress has requested access to certain communications, we've been told there are privacy concerns. But privacy for whom? The victim or the people who might be implicated?" She leaned forward slightly, her eyes locked on the camera. "Here's what concerns me most, Wolf. We have a bipartisan push for transparency. Republicans and Democrats who want these files reviewed and released. We have procedural mechanisms to make that happen. And yet, there's an enormous amount of pressure being applied to prevent it. DOJ officials showing up to meetings with classification stamps and warnings about national security. The White House counsel is making calls to congressional offices, all to stop a simple vote on whether Congress should see evidence related to one of the most significant criminal investigations of the decade. That's not normal. And it raises a very simple question. What are they so afraid of us seeing?" The response was immediate and exactly what Crockett had anticipated. Within an hour, a White House spokesperson issued a statement. "The Congresswoman's suggestions are irresponsible and dangerous. The Department of Justice follows proper protocols for classified information. And any implication of political interference is baseless and undermines national security interests." It was the kind of statement that sounded authoritative and meant nothing, designed to shut down the conversation without actually addressing any of the specifics. Crockett wasn't about to let them shut it down. The next morning, she held a press conference on Capitol Hill. And this time, she brought receipts. She displayed a timeline of dates when congressional oversight committees had requested information, dates when those requests had been denied or delayed, and dates when specific members had been contacted by executive branch officials, discouraging transparency measures. She showed the text of her resolution, all one page of it, that simply requested that sealed files related to the Epstein investigation be reviewed by the relevant congressional committees in closed session with appropriate security clearances. Nothing radical, nothing that would compromise sources or methods, just basic congressional oversight. "The White House says I'm being irresponsible," she said, her voice carrying across the press room. "Let me tell you what I think is irresponsible. I think it's irresponsible to have evidence of potential crimes by powerful people and to hide that evidence behind classification rules that were designed to protect national security, not political reputations. I think it's irresponsible to pressure members of Congress not to ask questions about who Jeffrey Epstein was connected to and what those connections might mean. And I think it's irresponsible to attack the people asking for transparency instead of just releasing the information and letting the chips fall where they may." A reporter from Politico asked the question everyone was thinking. "Are you saying President Trump is directly implicated in the Epstein files?" Crockett's answer was lawyer perfect. "I'm saying there are files that mention him. I'm saying there are communications that raise questions. I'm saying those questions deserve answers. And I'm saying that if there's nothing to hide, then there's no reason not to let Congress see what's in those files. The fact that there's this much resistance tells you everything you need to know about whether powerful people think those files are damaging. The political fallout was swift and predictable. Conservative media accused Crockett of conspiracy mongering and partisan witch hunts. Fox News ran segments questioning her motivations and suggesting she was doing this for attention. The New York Post editorial board wrote that she was trafficking in innuendo and trying to resurrect scandals that have already been investigated. Trump himself posted on social media that Crockett was another radical left Democrat trying to smear innocent people with baseless allegations about a criminal I barely knew. But something else was happening too. Other members of Congress started speaking up. A Republican senator from Utah known for his independent streak issued a statement saying he supported Crockett's call for congressional review of the files. A Democratic congressman who'd been investigating Epstein connections for years called her courageous for raising questions that too many of us have been afraid to ask. Even some mainstream media outlets that had initially dismissed the story started assigning reporters to dig deeper into what exactly was in those sealed files and why there was so much resistance to congressional oversight. Then came the leak. Someone, nobody could prove who, though everyone had theories, sent a heavily redacted document to several news organizations simultaneously. It appeared to be a partial transcript from one of the sealed depositions with most names blacked out, but enough context remaining to be explosive. In it, a witness described a gathering at Epstein's Palm Beach residence where a prominent political figure who was referred to in the document only as Individual 1 had been present during a time when several underage girls were also at the property. The witness didn't allege any direct misconduct by Individual 1, but described him as joking around with Epstein in a way that suggested he understood what was going on there. The document couldn't be verified, and the redactions made it impossible to confirm identities, but the timeline mentioned in the deposition matched dates when Trump was known to have socialized with Epstein. It was the kind of suggestive circumstantial evidence that didn't prove anything concrete but raised 1,000 more questions. And it played exactly into what Crockett had been arguing. There was information out there, information that powerful people didn't want the public to see. The White House went into full damage control mode. Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt held an emergency briefing, calling the leaked document unverified, potentially fabricated, and possibly illegal to distribute. She emphasized that the administration takes the integrity of ongoing investigations seriously, and that releasing partial, out-of-context documents serves no legitimate public interest. It was a response that would have shut down most controversy. But Crockett had learned something fundamental during her years as an attorney. When people are telling the truth, they want more information released to prove it. When they're hiding something, they argue that releasing information would be dangerous, irresponsible, or harmful. The White House's response fell squarely into the second category. She went back on CNN that evening for a follow-up with Jake Tapper. He asked her directly about the leaked document. "I can't verify its authenticity," she said carefully. "But I can tell you that if it is authentic, it's exactly the kind of information that Congress should have access to. We have security clearances. We have secure facilities for reviewing classified material. We have an obligation to provide oversight. The idea that we can't be trusted with information that might implicate powerful people is insulting and dangerous," Tapper pressed. "But doesn't releasing information like this, even in redacted form, risk compromising victim privacy or ongoing investigations?" "Absolutely it does," Crockett agreed immediately. "Which is why I'm not calling for public release. I'm calling for congressional review in closed session with appropriate safeguards. Let the relevant committees see the files. Let us assess whether there's criminal conduct that's been overlooked or whether there are legitimate reasons for secrecy. But this blanket refusal to let Congress do its oversight job, that's not about protecting victims or investigations. That's about protecting reputations." Behind the scenes, the pressure campaign was intensifying. Members who'd initially expressed support for Crockett's resolution started receiving calls from party leadership, from donors, and from White House liaisons. The message was consistent. This is politically dangerous territory. You don't want to be associated with a conspiracy theory. Think about your re-election. Think about your committee assignments. Think about your political future. Lauren Boebert, still the crucial vote needed to force the floor measure, remained publicly silent. But sources close to her staff suggested she was genuinely conflicted. On one hand, she'd built her brand on challenging government secrecy and supporting transparency. On the other hand, signing on to Crockett's resolution meant breaking with party leadership and potentially implicating a president she'd loyally supported. It was the kind of political calculation that defines careers. Do you stick to your stated principles when it becomes personally costly? The answer came on a Friday afternoon in the most anticlimactic way possible. Boebert released a one-paragraph statement. After reviewing the relevant materials and consulting with legal experts, I do not believe Representative Crockett's resolution meets the threshold for forcing a floor vote at this time. I support transparency in principle but believe the proper venue for reviewing classified material is through existing committee structures. Translation: she wasn't going to sign it. Crockett's response was immediate and pointed. Congresswoman Boebert talks a big game about fighting government secrecy and standing up to corruption. But when it came time to actually force a vote on whether Congress deserves to see evidence related to one of the most significant criminal cases of our generation, she folded. That tells you everything you need to know about whether the push for transparency is real or just convenient political branding. The resolution died without the necessary signature. The files remain sealed. The White House declared victory, with officials anonymously telling reporters that cooler heads had prevailed and that congressional showboating had been prevented. Conservative outlets celebrated Crockett's failure to generate support for what they continued to characterize as a partisan witch hunt. But the story didn't end there, because what Crockett had done, whether intentionally or not, was change the conversation. Before her CNN appearance and her push for congressional review, the Epstein files were yesterday's news. A scandal that had played out and moved on. After her very public fight for transparency, they became an active question again. Investigative journalists started filing new FOIA requests. Other members of Congress started asking about the classification decision. Civil liberties groups started demanding explanations for why congressional oversight was being blocked. 3 weeks after Boebert's refusal to sign the resolution, a federal judge in New York, responding to a lawsuit from a media coalition, ordered the partial unsealing of some deposition transcripts. The documents released were heavily redacted and included nothing directly implicating any specific individuals in crimes, but they did confirm what Crockett had been arguing. There were communications. There were connections. There were questions that hadn't been fully answered. The judge's ruling specifically noted that public interest in understanding the scope of Epstein's associations outweighs blanket claims of privacy. The final scene in this story happened not in a congressional hearing room or on a news set, but in Crockett's Capitol Hill office on a Tuesday morning. An aide knocked on her door and handed her a manila envelope. No return address, no identifying marks, just a seal that read Department of Justice restricted access. Inside was a single page, a memo heavily redacted but with enough visible text to be clear, detailing conversations between DOJ officials and White House counsel about managing congressional inquiries related to sensitive investigations. Crockett read it twice, her expression irritable. The document didn't prove a cover-up, but it strongly suggested coordination between the executive branch and justice officials on how to handle congressional oversight requests. It was the kind of smoking gun that wasn't quite smoking but definitely smelled like gunpowder. She handed it back to her aide with a simple instruction. Make copies. Secure them. We're going to need these. Whether that envelope was real, whether its contents would ever see the light of day, whether Crockett's fight for transparency would ultimately succeed. Those questions remained unanswered as the news cycle moved on to other controversies and other battles. But she'd done something important. She'd asked the questions that most people were too afraid to ask. She demanded accountability when it would have been easier to stay quiet. And she'd reminded everyone watching that in a functioning democracy, the people's representatives don't ask permission to do oversight. They demand it. If this deep dive into how Jasmine Crockett took on the establishment over the Epstein files cover-up showed you something you didn't know, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about the political fights that actually matter. Drop a comment telling us what sealed files you think deserve congressional review. And share this with anyone who believes that transparency shouldn't be negotiable. Your engagement helps us keep digging into the stories that powerful people hope you'll forget.